This module we'll learn about the duration of copyright protection as well as copyright ownership of a work. Determining who is the copyright owner of a work may sometimes be confusing. Many of the students in this class are technical communicators, designers, or visual developers, and the concept of work for hire will play a role in determining whether or not they own the work they create. Additionally, ownership rights can be sold in a myriad of ways. For example, an author can sell just serial rights for North America, which means they are giving up the right for any other magazine or serial publication to exclusively publish the work in North America. Or they could sell electronic rights or one-time rights or exclusive rights. Remember, it's the copyright owner of a piece who has the right to transfer ownership. Remember that the bundle of rights that copyright contains includes transferring any of these rights. The length of time for which a copyright owner has exclusive rights to transfer, make a profit, copy, etc. from their work is known as copyright duration. And there are some variables to determining the expiration date. The copyright term calculator, which is linked in your readings, is very helpful in determining this.
Before you continue viewing this lecture, it would be very helpful for you to review Circular 9 because it'll give you a much better idea, and then come back and continue the lecture.
So I hope you have looked at Circular 9 Works for Hire to get an idea of what we're going to be talking about next. The circular attempts to clarify Section 101 of Title 17 of the U.S. Code. There are two different ways a creation could be termed work for hire, and they're described in Circular 9. If either of these conditions are met, the item is considered work for hire. This affects who owns the copyright to a work.
So let's look at number 1 in more detail. A work prepared by an employee within the scope of his or her employment. So copyright in this case is always owned by the person or the company commissioning the item to be made. So what does this look like? An employer tells, which another word for that is commissions, his employee to do the work and write the report on XYZ, okay? The employee never owns copyright for the work, okay? The work, however, must be within what would be reasonably considered the scope of his employment. So if Maria is an account executive and creates a presentation on last year's sales figures, that is within the scope of her duties, and therefore the company would own copyright because it is work for hire. It's part of her regular job. However, if Maria is part of the cleaning staff and creates the report, it's not within the scope of her employment. Therefore, she owns copyright. Okay, and that's something that we need to look at a little more carefully as we look at some of these scenarios. So let's move on to way number 2. Okay, the work has to be specially ordered or commissioned and in one of the categories below, and the parties have to expressly agree in a written instrument that the work is going to be considered work for hire. Let's take a look closer. So let's pretend that ABC Company needs a new logo drawn. Okay, they don't have a graphic designer because they're so small. Miss In Charge, get it? She's in charge, so that's why I'm calling her Miss In Charge. Decides that she needs to find a graphic designer to create this logo. So she goes to one of the many find a freelancer sites, such as Upwork, okay, to find a graphic designer. She finds one, looks at his portfolio, and decides that she likes what he does. So she emails the graphic designer, and we're calling him Freddie the freelancer, and she tells him what she needs. Okay. Freddie isn't a regular employee. He's been hired to do this one task. He's an independent contractor. That means he gets to control when and where he does the work. Miss In Charge can't tell him, for example, he can only create the logo between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. He pays his own employment taxes, such as Social Security and payroll tax. Okay? Whether or not someone has independent contractor status is a really important concern here when you're dealing with freelance workers. You might want to look at the reading this week on what classifies someone as an independent contractor if this is something of your interest. Okay, so let's keep continuing, okay? So the work has to be in one of the 9 types listed, but actually it's pretty easy to classify works in these categories. We would just say the logo was considered to be a contribution to a collective work. So Freddie creates 6 different designs that Miss in Charge can pick from. Who owns the copyright to those designs? Well, let's look again at the criteria for something to be work for hire. Remember, there's 2 ways that something can be work for hire. The first is that the work was prepared for an employer within the normal scope of the employee's duties. Okay? Is that true in this case? No, because we have already said that Freddie is not an employee. He was specially hired for this one job. So let's look at the second way, number 2. The second is that the item is specially commissioned work. It's from one of the 9 categories listed, and there is a written agreement expressly transferring copyright and naming it as work for hire. Okay. For option number 2, both of those subconditions must be true in order for it to be work for hire under that condition. So let's go back to Miss in Charge and Freddie. To qualify as a work for hire under number 1, Miss in Charge would have to tell her employee, a graphic designer, to create a logo. But we know Freddie isn't an employee. He doesn't regularly work for this company. He is just completing this one task. Okay, so it doesn't qualify as work for hire under number 1. So let's look at number 2. For something to be considered work for hire under condition number 2, these 2 factors must both be true. So, was the item specially ordered? Was it in one of the 9 categories? And is there a written agreement expressly stating that the work is work for hire or the copyright is being transferred? Do we know that? Not in this case.
If there's no written agreement explicitly transferring ownership to ABC Company, then Freddie Freelancer is the owner of the copyright, even though Miss in Charge paid him to create the logo for the company. If there's a written agreement explicitly transferring ownership to ABC Company, then Freddie Freelancer never owned the copyright to the work. ABC Company has ownership of the copyright. There are some facets of contract law, delivery, and acceptance we're going to leave out of this situation to make it more simple, though. The written contract transferring ownership rights is the key element here. It must be written, and it must explicitly state that ownership is being transferred.
Suppose, instead, that the written agreement said this: I will agree to create a logo for ABC Company by the date using the specs and parameters given to me, and ABC is going to pay me $200. Okay. Freddie has not agreed to transfer his ownership rights in this written agreement. Therefore, he still owns copyright of the logos. This is why companies who hire freelancers are very cautious about getting explicit transfer of ownership rights in writing. So let's go back and review. There are 2 ways something can be considered work for hire, either number 1 or number 2. For number 1, the work has to be prepared by an employee in the normal scope of his duties. That's all that has to be happening for that case to be work for hire. Okay. Number 2, several things have to happen. It needs to be specially commissioned, be in one of those 9 categories, and there must be a written agreement between the parties transferring ownership. Okay. However, in Circular 9, there's a confusing paragraph that I'd like to try to clarify. Okay. Here it says if a work is made for hire, the employer or other person for whom the work was prepared is the initial owner of the copyright, unless both parties involved have signed a written agreement to the contrary. Just think about that. Okay. The employer is always the initial owner. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so if the work was done by an employee, okay, it's always going to be work for hire. The minute it's created, the employer is going to own the copyright. Okay, unless of course the employer agrees otherwise, which is not going to happen in corporate America. Okay. In the case of a person commissioned to create something in those 9 categories, their work is only called work for hire if there is a contract transferring ownership and deeming the work to be work for hire. When there is a contract, the person creating the work never owned the copyright. Remember, copyright rights begin the moment an item is created in a fixed form, written down, drawn, whatever. Since the item was created under contract, the item was created under work for hire conditions, and thus the creator, the writer, never owned the copyright. Okay, I know this is confusing, so let's go over this a couple more ways. Okay, so in the case of an employee, okay, a contract is needed to transfer the rights back to the employee. Yeah, that's the only way that an employee is going to be able to own the rights. Okay. In number 2, the contract is needed to transfer the rights to the employer or person specially commissioning the work. And just watch this for a second. Okay. So, if something is prepared by an employee, the employer owns the copyright. If for some reason the company is giving the rights back to the employee, a contract is needed to transfer them back. Okay? The employer is the original owner of the copyright. If it is something that has been specially commissioned or ordered, created by an independent contractor, the independent contractor is the owner of the initial copyright unless there was a written contract stating that it was work for hire and that rights were being transferred. Okay. So in one case, for the person who creates it to get the rights, they need a contract. And in the other case, case number 2, in order for the person to who created it to get the rights, there can't be a contract transferring ownership. So it's the exact opposite. I know it's confusing, and this is why the attorneys make so very much money.
It's important to remember that the author of a work is not always the owner of the copyright of a work. The author may have transferred or sold the right to copy their work to someone else. They also may have never had ownership of a copyright, as in the case of work for hire.
So let's leave copyright ownership and work for hire alone for a little bit, and let's move on to how long copyright lasts. How long does someone or a company own the copyright for some specific creation? Let's take a look.
Recall that in the Constitution, no specific time period for copyright or patent protection was included. As the nation grew, the need to specify a time period was realized, and the Copyright Act of 1790 declared that the initial term of copyright would be for 14 years from the time a work was created, and then there would be an option to renew for another 14 years. In 1831, the revision of the Copyright Act changed the term length to 28 years and an option to renew for another 14 years. In 1909, Congress kept the 28-year initial term, but added a 28-year renewal option. In 1976, the revision of the Copyright Act changed the beginning date of the time period to the date of the author's death, as opposed to the creation date. This revision of the Copyright Act created a life plus 50-year copyright term with no option to renew. It's important to remember that until 1976, the expiration date of protection depended upon the date a work was created. When the term was predicated on the life of an author, works for hire and corporate authored works became an issue. After all, whose death date would be used? At this time, Congress instituted the dual copyright term lengths. In 1976, while human authors received life plus 50 years of protection, Works for hire and corporate authored works were protected for 75 years from the creation date. 1998, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, which was also called the Mickey Mouse Act or the CTEA, increased the term length to the author's life plus 7 years with no option to renew. At that time, works created under work for hire, work that was created under a pseudonym, or corporate authored works were given a term of 95 years from the year of the work's first publication or a term of 120 years from the year of its creation, whichever expired first. The last revision of copyright terms occurred in 1998 with the CTEA. Several parties, as you will read this week, successfully lobbied Congress to extend this term. The individuals and companies that lobbied for a term extension included primarily those who stood to gain from the extension, those owners of lucrative copyrights, such as Disney, the Gershwin family, Rogers and Hammerstein. This extension effectively prevented many works from entering the public domain, as they would now have an additional 20 years of protection. In fact, some works whose copyright had expired and were already in the public domain were pulled out of it and became copyright protected retroactively. The copyright on many of these works was set to expire in 2019, and many predicted lobbyists would once again make their way onto the scene to get another term extension. This week you'll learn about many of the proponents and opponents' arguments for extension, as well as what ended up happening. During the periods when there was an option to renew, there were formalities that a copyright owner had to take to renew. If these were not taken, the copyright term for that piece of work remained at the original copyright term amount. Determining how long a work was protected by copyright requires knowledge of not only when the work was published and when the author died, but also if a renewal was properly filed. Congress made renewals automatic for works published from 1923 to 1964, and after 1976, life of the author plus 50 years eliminated this issue. Considerations of where the work was first published also come into play. Finally, until March 1, 1989, a work was required to have a copyright notice to be protected. However, at that time, the requirement was discontinued. Pay special attention to the flowchart that is on the Public Domain Sherpa website, and make sure to mouse over the diagram text for more information. It's important to understand what information is needed in order to determine a copyright expiration date. To find the expiration date of copyright protection, the Public Domain Sherpa also has an interactive method to determine this. When you click on the copyright term calculator, if your screen does not look like this image, you will have to allow Flash to run in order for it to work. The instructions are on the right side of the screen.